This first video for Chapter 13 will provide an introduction to descriptive research and then go into some detail on observational studies. What is the goal of descriptive research? Descriptive research is really focused on capturing very interesting and naturally occurring behaviors. It wants to describe the behavior, but not explain it. It's looking at a single variable or describing an individual when there's multiple individuals involved. So again, it's measuring things as they exist naturally and not the relationship between the variables, which is what we discussed in Chapter 12 on correlations, that we were looking at in correlational studies are looking at the relationship between variables. Here, we're just describing the variables and typically a single variable. Now, it can get a little confusing because sometimes other types of research, including experiments, are also using some descriptive techniques. So again, the goal is to measure a variable or a set of variables as they exist naturally. And again, we're not concerned with the relationship between variables. So before we get into some other examples, do you remember this little girl from back in Chapter 6? Jeannie. And she was a great example of a descriptive study, of a case study in particular, right? Where she was found, tied to a bed, hadn't been exposed to language, and then they used her and described her ability or inability to learn language. Here's another example. So this is from the National Comorbidity Survey, which is a large-scale mental health survey that's conducted in the United States. And this is just one part of the survey, where nearly 10,000 adults were given a structured mental health interview in their homes in 2002 and 2003, and this table presents the results on the lifetime prevalence of some anxiety, mood, and substance use disorders. So again, it's describing the prevalence of these disorders. It's not predicting anything. It's not saying that there's any causal explanations. It's just describing the outcomes. So the first type of study we're going to talk about are observational studies. So the observational research design is where researchers carefully and systematically observe and record a behavior. Now that systematic observing and recording, typically they have an idea of what they're going to observe before they sit down to start observing, and they have an idea of what they're recording before they sit down and start observing as well. And the goal is to try not to interfere with the behavior. And we'll see that can be difficult, but there's ways to get around that. So the results are simply to describe the variable that's being studied. Again, not trying to look at a relationship between variables, not trying to determine a cause and effect, to describe the variables being studied. So a behavioral observation, also sometimes called a naturalistic observation, is where we're observing individuals in their natural environment. So here's just some examples of those. So you're actually going to do a discussion assignment on this video, and hopefully you recognize this individual. She's a very famous biologist that went to Africa to study the chimpanzees. Her name is Jane Goodall. And so you're going to watch a video that's an example of what she learned through her observational studies, just to give you a good idea of the types of information that can be gained from these descriptive types of studies. Here's just another example. You could go to a playground and observe aggressive behavior, something like that, or you could observe cooperative play. Same thing, this little video clip, if you want to see more, watch more about it, you can press on the link in the lecture notes, but it also shows you behavior in a preschool setting. And the goal with each of these is, again, to study individuals in their natural environment. Here, she was studying them in Africa, for an African forest. Here, you're studying them at a playground. You're looking for whatever behavior you're interested in, and you just sit there. You sit back, have your things that you're going to check off, and you look for those behaviors. Here, you're in a classroom. And so a lot of times you see these studies going on where individuals will go into those settings and try to just kind of blend in. Now, of course, there's going to be some problems with this technique. Behaviors may be disrupted or influenced by the observer. For example, there might be demand characteristics, which is a subtle cue that makes the participant aware of what the experimenter expects to find or how the experimenter is expected to behave. The best example I could think of that is, I always think of Clever Hans and how Clever Hans, the horse, knew how to do the math problems based on little cues that his teacher didn't even know he was doing. Also, this idea of reactivity, which is a phenomenon that occurs when individuals alter their performance or their behavior due to the awareness that they're being observed. And so this is just a little funny clip that demonstrates that.
Let me talk to him. Hi, babies.
So as you saw in that video, it's just a clear-cut example of observer influences, right? Is those kids, when they didn't think they were, being watched, they're up dancing around during nap time, and then as soon as they hear their mom's voice, they know that they're being observed, they pretend to sleep. So the idea is that just being observed can influence someone's behavior. The other thing that's wrong with this technique is that the observations are subjective. There's not a lot of objectivity to them. It's up to the individual observer to determine maybe what they think is aggressive behavior, or what they think, like you'll see for the chimpanzees, what is tool use. And so that subjectivity can really make us question the reliability of these behavioral observations. And so that's why sometimes you can do something called inter-observer reliability, where you have two or more people observing the same thing, and then you check to see if those observations that they made are similar. Do they correlate with each other? And you were going to do an inter-observer lab, but that would have required you to go off someplace with a partner and view behavior, and since we cannot do that, that has been taken off the table. We'll do another type of lab instead. So how can we address the problems with these behavioral observations? The first question is demand characteristics and reactivity. So how can we not have an observer effect? And one of those things is addressed by just concealing the observer. So Jane Goodall, when she first went to Africa, she really tried to blend in, and she did well for a while, but after a while they also got very used to her. So somebody who's going into a preschool setting to observe something, maybe the teacher just tells them that it's another teacher that's coming to learn or something like that. The second problem, that reliability, is what I mentioned on the previous slide, is using that inter-rater reliability, where you have two or more individuals that are rating the same behavior in the same setting, and you look to see, do their scores correlate? Are they the same? So another type of observational study is a laboratory observation or a contrived study. And this is when you do this type of study when you need more of a controlled setting or perhaps sophisticated equipment. So you'll watch some examples of some laboratory observations on your own. So there are three techniques used to quantify the behavioral observations. The first is the frequency method. That's just sitting there in that observational setting and counting the number of times a person engages in a specific behavior. For example, how many times does a child speak to an adult in a social interaction? That would be counting the number of times the child is doing a certain behavior. Another example, or another technique, is the duration method. Now this might be where you have this fixed time observation, and during that time you want to see how much time does that child spend interacting in that behavior of interest. For example, how long does a child interact with an adult in a social situation? So you're getting the duration of that interaction, the length of time. Another technique is the interval method. So where you break up the time of observation into intervals and you tally how many of those intervals involved a certain behavior. So in interval number 1, maybe there a 30-minute observation period is divided into 31-minute periods or something like that. And so in that 1-minute observation period, did they engage in the behavior of interest? In this next interval, did they engage in that behavior of interest? And so on and so forth. And so then overall you'd say, The child was observed interacting with an adult during 12 of the intervals in that 30-minute time period. So it just gives you different results and different ways of gathering data, all of course which would be decided in advance. So you'll complete this observation exercise as a separate assignment. It's something that we would typically do in class, but I think it's something that's good for you to help you understand how you quantify these observations. When observing complex situations, sometimes we need to record the situation, and recording that situation allows us to replay it repeatedly to gather the observations. So not only can we replay it repeatedly, we can also have multiple individuals observe that at the same time. So there are 3 techniques that are used for sampling observations. The first is time sampling. So this is where you look at one interval, so you observe maybe 1 minute of the video, you pause the video, and then you record all the behaviors that you observed. Then you go on to the next interval. You watch that interval and record all the behaviors that you observed. The next one is event sampling. So this is where you look at one event for the first interval, and then moving on to a second behavior to observe in the second interval, and so on and so forth. Another type of sampling is individual sampling, where in the first interval perhaps you're just looking at one individual, the next interval you go on to a different individual, and so on and so forth.